Ever wondered what marriage looked like 800 years ago? Did women have any say in who they married? The answers might shock you. Number 6. Did I do actually mean I had no choice? Picture this. You're a teenage girl in medieval Europe. Your father tells you one morning that you'll be marrying a man 3 times your age by the end of the week. Someone you've never met. Someone who might live in another country. Someone who will have complete control over your body, your property, and your future. Sound like a nightmare. For countless medieval women, this was simply reality. The medieval concept of marital consent is complicated and frankly disturbing by modern standards. On one hand, the Church insisted that marriages required the consent of both parties to be valid. Sounds progressive, right? The reality was far messier. Church teachings from the 12th century onward emphasized that consent was absolutely necessary for a valid marriage. Pope Alexander III declared that mutual consent was the essential element that created marriage. The famous medieval theologian Peter Lombard wrote that efficient cause of matrimony is consent, basically saying no consent meant no marriage, but here's where it gets tricky. For the Church, consent didn't necessarily mean enthusiastic agreement or even willing participation. It often just meant the absence of explicit refusal. If you didn't openly say no during the ceremony, that was close enough to a yes for most purposes. One particularly troubling aspect, in cases where families disputed whether consent had been given, courts often looked for evidence that a woman had eventually had sex with her husband. If she had, many courts took this as retroactive proof that she had consented to the marriage, even if she had been forced or coerced. Number 5. At what age could children be married off? Ready for something truly disturbing. The minimum age for consent to marriage was shockingly low. Canon law, church law, set the minimum age for betrothal at 7 years old. Yes, you read that right, 7. The minimum age for actual marriage consent was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These ages weren't chosen randomly. They roughly corresponded to when children were thought to reach puberty in medieval times. At these ages, children were considered capable of giving consent to a lifelong contract that would determine their entire future. A 7-year-old could be betrothed, and once a girl turned 12, she could be legally married off. Imagine a modern 12-year-old girl being considered mature enough to consent to marriage. The thought is absurd today, but for medieval families, particularly nobility, arranging marriages for children was common practice. These children had little understanding of what marriage meant, beyond the basics they'd been taught. And while these were the official rules, enforcement varied wildly. In practice, royal and noble families sometimes arranged marriages for children even younger than 7, though these marriages weren't supposed to be consummated until the bride reached the acceptable age. Margaret Beaufort, mother of England's King Henry VII, was married at age 12 and gave birth at 13. The physical toll was so great that she never conceived again, despite 2 subsequent marriages. This wasn't considered particularly unusual or problematic at the time. The physical and emotional readiness of these child brides was rarely considered. The focus was on political alliances, property transfers, and family connections, not on whether a 12-year-old girl was ready to run a household, please a husband, or bear children. Number 4. Who really had control over marriage decisions? Did medieval women actually get to choose their husbands? For the vast majority, the answer is a resounding no. While the Church may have technically required consent, The social and economic realities meant that most women and many men had very little actual choice in their marriage partners. Marriage was first and foremost an economic arrangement and a way to forge alliances between families. Fathers maintained almost complete control over their daughters' marriages, especially among the nobility and wealthier merchant classes. Women were essentially assets to be deployed for maximum family advantage. A nobleman might use his daughter's marriage to secure an alliance with another powerful family, gain access to new lands, or settle a feud. The pressure to accept parental choices was enormous. Medieval society offered few paths for women outside of marriage or the convent. Women who defied their family's marriage plans might find themselves disowned, cut off from financial support, and socially ostracized. This doesn't mean that no women had input into their marriages. Some widows enjoyed considerably more freedom in choosing subsequent husbands. Women from merchant families in certain regions, particularly in parts of Italy and the Low Countries, sometimes had more say than their noble counterparts. Historical records show rare cases of women who successfully refused unwanted matches by appealing to church courts. The 12th century English noblewoman Christina of Marquiate fled her arranged marriage and eventually won her case for annulment after years of struggle. But these exceptions only highlight how unusual it was for women to successfully assert their preferences. For every Christina who managed to escape an unwanted match, countless others had no choice but to accept their fate. Parents used various forms of pressure to ensure compliance. A father might threaten to withhold a dowry, making his daughter less attractive to other potential suitors. Mothers often prepared daughters from early childhood to accept arranged marriages as their duty. Physical force wasn't uncommon if a daughter seemed reluctant. Number 3. What counted as force in medieval marriage law? If medieval marriage required consent, surely forced marriages were invalid, right? Well, technically, yes. But the definition of force was extremely narrow. For a marriage to be considered forced, in the eyes of medieval church courts, the coercion usually had to involve immediate threats of serious bodily harm or death. A woman claiming her marriage was forced needed to prove she faced severe and immediate danger if she refused. Psychological pressure, financial coercion, or threats of disinheritance rarely counted as force. A father could threaten to disown his daughter, lock her in her room for months, or make her life utterly miserable, and the church would still consider her subsequent consent valid. Even more troubling, a woman claiming force had to have registered her objection immediately, ideally during the ceremony itself, and continued to resist afterward. If she eventually gave in and lived as a wife, courts often ruled that any initial coercion had been overcome by her subsequent consent. Consider the case recorded in church court documents from 15th century England. A woman claimed her father had threatened to kill her if she didn't marry his chosen suitor. The court rejected her petition for annulment because she had lived with her husband for several months before complaining, which they took as evidence that she had eventually consented. The burden of proof in these cases was extremely high. Women needed witnesses willing to testify to the coercion, which was difficult when marriages were often arranged within close family circles. Family members who had participated in the coercion were hardly likely to admit to it later. Moreover, courts were explicitly biased toward preserving existing marriages rather than dissolving them. Marriage was considered a sacrament, and judges were often more concerned with maintaining social order than protecting individual rights. Even more alarming was the concept of raptus, abduction, in medieval law. In some cases, men who abducted women could legitimize their actions by marrying their victims. While the church officially condemned such practices, local customs and secular authorities sometimes recognized these marriages as valid if the woman eventually consented, even after being kidnapped. Number 2. Did wedding night consent matter at all? The disturbing reality of medieval marriage becomes even clearer when we examine what happened after the wedding ceremony. Once married, a woman had virtually no right to refuse sexual relations with her husband. The concept of marital rape simply didn't exist in medieval law. Marriage explicitly granted a husband sexual rights over his wife's body. The influential 13th century legal text Fleta stated that a man could not be prosecuted for raping his wife because the marriage contract gave him perpetual consent to sexual access. The medieval church reinforced this view through the concept of conjugal debt, the idea that both husband and wife owed each other sexual availability. However, in practice, this concept was applied asymmetrically, primarily enforcing wives' obligation to their husbands rather than the reverse. Women who refused to consummate their marriages could face serious consequences. Church courts might order a reluctant wife to return to her husband and perform her marital duties. Persistent refusal could result in charges of disobedience or even heresy in extreme cases. The physical realities for young brides were often brutal. Girls married at 12 or 13 were physically unprepared for sexual activity and childbearing. Medical texts from the period contain disturbing accounts of treatments for injuries sustained by young wives on their wedding nights. Medieval literature sometimes romanticized wedding nights, but historical records tell a different story. Court cases occasionally mention women who fled their marital beds, locked themselves away, or begged relatives to intervene. These desperate measures rarely succeeded and often resulted in forced return to the husband. Some noble families actually sent witnesses to ensure consummation occurred. In royal marriages, courtiers might literally watch the couple enter the bed and sometimes remain to verify the marriage was consummated. The infamous bedding ceremony, practiced in some regions, involved the wedding party escorting the couple to their bedroom, sometimes staying to witness the consummation. A wife's refusal to consummate could provide grounds for annulment, one of the few escape routes from an unwanted marriage. However, proving non-consummation was difficult and often humiliating, involving physical examinations and intimate testimony. Number 1. How did people try to break unwanted marriage contracts? Despite all these restrictions, medieval people sometimes found creative ways to resist or escape unwanted marriages. The desperation behind these attempts reveals just how trapped many felt. One common strategy was to claim a pre-existing marriage contract with someone else. Since medieval law recognized that simple consent between partners could create a binding marriage, even without witnesses or ceremony, claiming a prior secret exchange of vows could potentially invalidate a subsequent formal marriage. Church records contain numerous cases of women, and sometimes men, suddenly producing evidence of prior marriage promises when faced with unwanted matches. In 1292, a woman named Marjorie of Selby claimed she had secretly exchanged marriage vows with John of Selby before her family forced her to marry William the Cooper. Her case dragged on for months before being dismissed for lack of evidence. Another approach was to claim a close blood relationship with one's spouse. Medieval church law prohibited marriage between relatives up to the 4th degree. Third cousins. Given the interrelated nature of medieval communities, many couples were technically related within these prohibited degrees. People unhappy in their marriages sometimes suddenly discovered such relationships. Some desperate individuals claimed they had taken religious vows or were previously betrothed to God. Since promises to the divine outranked promises to humans, a convincing claim of having secretly committed to religious life could potentially void a marriage. Physical escape was another option, though incredibly risky. Records mention women who fled to convents, disguised themselves as men, or sought refuge with sympathetic relatives. These fugitives risked being forcibly returned to their husbands, imprisonment, or complete social ostracism. The most desperate sometimes resorted to murder. Court records from across Europe document cases of wives who poisoned abusive husbands or husbands who arranged accidents for unwanted wives. Such actions almost invariably led to execution if discovered. For those with wealth and connections, buying an annulment was sometimes possible. The Church officially condemned the practice, but historical evidence suggests that well-placed bribes could help secure favorable judgments in annulment cases, particularly among the nobility. Success in these escape attempts varied wildly depending on social class, gender, and local customs. A noblewoman with powerful family connections might successfully petition for an annulment, while a peasant wife had virtually no recourse, regardless of her circumstances. What's particularly striking is how many medieval people were willing to risk everything: social standing, family relationships, even their lives, to escape unwanted marriages. How desperate would someone have to be to take such risks in a society that offered so few options for those who lived outside its norms? What does this history teach us about how far we've come in our understanding of consent? And what uncomfortable parallels might still exist in parts of the world today?